November 18, 1944. Somewhere in the frozen hills of northern Italy, Private István Kovács pressed his face against the metal grating of the transport truck, watching the Italian countryside blur past in shades of gray and white. His stomach growled with a hunger so profound it had become part of his identity, as familiar as his own heartbeat. For 3 years, he had survived on watery soup, moldy bread, and the occasional scrap of horsemeat that German officers deemed unfit for their own consumption. Now, as a prisoner of the American army, he expected nothing different. Perhaps worse. The propaganda had been clear: Americans were soft, wasteful, undisciplined. Their soldiers were pampered children playing at war, certain to collapse when faced with real hardship. What István was about to discover would not only challenge everything he believed about American military strength, but would reveal a truth so profound about abundance, dignity, and the psychology of warfare that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Most people assume that World War II prisoner experiences were uniformly brutal, that captivity meant starvation, abuse, and dehumanization regardless of which nation held you. The reality was far more complex, and nowhere was this complexity more evident than in the stark contrast between Axis and Allied treatment of prisoners. What happened when Hungarian soldiers, conditioned by years of scarcity in German military culture, encountered American abundance would expose assumptions about power, resources, and the true cost of maintaining human dignity during wartime. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a moment that transformed not just individual prisoners, but fundamentally challenged their understanding of what it meant to wage war in the modern age. The story begins not with capture, but with the systematic starvation that had become routine for Hungarian forces fighting alongside Germany. By late 1944, the Axis war machine was collapsing under the weight of its own logistical impossibilities. Supply lines stretched beyond breaking, resources diverted to desperate defensive operations, and soldiers like István found themselves fighting on empty stomachs and sheer willpower. István Kovács had been a schoolteacher in the small town of Eger before conscription swept him into a war he barely understood. At 26, he had expected to spend his life educating children about Hungarian literature and history, not freezing in Italian mountain passes while German officers screamed orders in a language he could barely comprehend. His unit, the 2nd Hungarian Mountain Brigade, had been attached to German forces retreating before the Allied advance through Italy. They were not elite troops or ideological fanatics, but ordinary men caught in the machinery of a dying empire. The hunger had started gradually. First, the meat rations disappeared, replaced by promises of resupply that never materialized. Then the bread portions shrank, the quality deteriorating until they were eating something that resembled compressed sawdust more than actual food. By autumn 1944, István's daily ration consisted of approximately 800 calories, less than half what a soldier required for basic survival, let alone combat operations. His body had adapted through a process he could only describe as controlled deterioration. Muscle mass disappeared first, his frame shrinking until his uniform hung like a tent over protruding bones. His face became gaunt, cheekbones pressing against skin that had taken on a grayish pallor. Most disturbing was the mental fog that descended, thoughts moving through treacle as his brain conserved energy for essential functions. The other men in his unit showed similar signs of advanced malnutrition. Corporal Zoltán Szabó, who had been a butcher before the war, developed elaborate fantasies about food that he shared during night watches. He could describe, in excruciating detail, the preparation of paprikash, the texture of fresh bread, the taste of real butter. These descriptions became a form of torture, yet the men couldn't stop themselves from listening, from participating in collective hallucinations of abundance that existed only in memory. German officers, meanwhile, maintained separate rations that included actual meat, real coffee, and chocolate. This disparity wasn't hidden but flaunted, a deliberate demonstration of hierarchy that reminded Hungarian troops of their subordinate status. István had watched a German lieutenant discard half a sausage because it was too fatty, tossing food that represented more calories than István consumed in 2 days into a waste bin with casual indifference. The propaganda about American weakness had been relentless and specific. Americans, they were told, couldn't function without luxuries. Their soldiers required special foods, complained about minor discomforts, and collapsed under real hardship. This supposed softness was presented as both a tactical advantage and a moral failing, proof that democratic societies produced inferior warriors. István had believed this narrative because he wanted to believe it. The alternative, that they were losing to a genuinely superior military force, was too psychologically devastating to accept. Better to imagine that American success came from numerical superiority and material advantages rather than organizational excellence or ideological commitment. The capture itself had been almost anticlimactic. His unit had been defending a mountain pass when American artillery began falling with precision that suggested perfect intelligence. The barrage lasted 30 minutes, a demonstration of firepower that exceeded anything István had experienced. When it ended, American infantry advanced with coordinated efficiency that left no opportunity for effective resistance. István had raised his hands along with the surviving members of his unit, expecting the worst. German propaganda had warned of American brutality toward prisoners, of summary executions and torture. Instead, American soldiers had processed them with bureaucratic efficiency, checking for weapons, documenting names and units, and distributing paper cups of water that István drank so quickly he vomited. The first shock had been the American medics. While German medical personnel reserved treatment for their own forces, American medics immediately began treating Hungarian wounded with the same care given to American casualties. István watched in confusion as a young American soldier, barely 20 years old, carefully bandaged the leg wound of a Hungarian private who had been shooting at Americans hours earlier. Corporal Sabo, lying on a stretcher beside István, had whispered his disbelief. "They're wasting medical supplies on us. This makes no sense from a military perspective." His training as a butcher gave him practical understanding of resource management, and nothing about American behavior aligned with rational allocation during wartime scarcity. The transport to the processing center had taken 2 days, moving through Allied-controlled territory in trucks that shocked István with their mechanical reliability. Unlike the German vehicles that constantly broke down, requiring endless repairs and jury-rigged solutions, these American trucks simply functioned. No dramatic failures, no emergency maintenance, just consistent operation that suggested manufacturing quality beyond his experience. During stops, American guards distributed rations that István initially assumed were special prisoner meals, minimal nutrition to keep them alive for interrogation. The reality proved more confusing. Each man received a cardboard box containing items István couldn't immediately identify. Canned meat, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes, and small packets of powder that dissolved in water to create something approximating fruit juice. The portions seemed impossibly large for prisoner rations. István had consumed his entire box within minutes, unable to control himself despite knowing that overeating after prolonged starvation could cause serious illness. The chocolate alone contained more calories than his typical daily German ration. He had expected to feel satisfied, but instead experienced a creeping sense of unease that he couldn't articulate. Zoltán had been more analytical, examining the packaging with professional interest. "Look at this," he said, holding up an empty can. "The metal quality is exceptional. The sealing is perfect. They're giving us food stored in containers that cost more to produce than the food itself." His background in food processing made him sensitive to manufacturing details that István had overlooked. Other prisoners shared similar observations. The cigarettes were fresh, not the stale remnants that German forces distributed. The crackers were crisp, suggesting recent production and proper storage. Every detail contradicted their assumptions about American resource management and military priorities. The processing center, designated Camp Norton near the town of Pisa, had been constructed with the same efficient standardization that characterized all American military operations. Rows of identical barracks, central facilities for mess and administration, and security perimeter that seemed more concerned with organization than intimidation. The whole compound resembled a temporary industrial facility more than a prison camp. István and approximately 400 other Hungarian prisoners arrived on a cold November evening, processed through intake procedures that included medical examinations, delousing, and uniform exchange. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. American personnel conducted these procedures with mechanical efficiency, neither hostile nor particularly friendly, simply executing established protocols. The medical examination shocked István more than anything he had experienced since capture. An American doctor, speaking through a Hungarian interpreter who turned out to be an American-born second-generation immigrant, examined each prisoner with thorough professionalism. He documented István's malnutrition, noting weight loss, vitamin deficiencies, and early signs of scurvy. The doctor's expression remained neutral, but István could sense disapproval directed not at the prisoners but at the conditions that had produced such deterioration. "You'll be placed on a graduated feeding program," the interpreter translated. "Your body can't handle normal portions yet. Will increase gradually over 2 weeks until you reach standard caloric intake." The concept of a graduated feeding program, of medical personnel calculating optimal nutrition for enemy prisoners, seemed extravagant beyond comprehension. The barracks assignment brought István together with men from different Hungarian units, creating an accidental community of strangers united by shared experience. The building itself was heated, another luxury that seemed wasteful for prisoner housing. Bunks included actual mattresses and blankets, not the straw pallets and thin covers that German forces provided. That first night, lying in relative comfort while his body processed more food than it had seen in months, István engaged in whispered conversation with his new bunkmate, Private Mihai Nagy. Mihai had been captured 2 weeks earlier and had already begun adapting to the psychological dissonance of American captivity. "Wait until you see breakfast," Mihai said with a laugh that sounded slightly unhinged. "You won't believe it." None of us believed it at first. We thought it was some kind of trick, maybe propaganda for Red Cross inspectors. "But it's real, and it's every single day." István pressed for details, but Mihai insisted that explanation was inadequate. "You have to see it yourself. Words don't capture it. Just know that everything you think you understand about this war is about to change." Sleep came fitfully, István's body struggling to process unaccustomed nutrition while his mind raced with questions about what morning would bring. Around him, other prisoners snored or muttered in their sleep, their bodies responding to the first real rest many had experienced in months. The wake-up call came at 0600, earlier than István expected for prisoners who posed no immediate labor requirement. American guards moved through the barracks, their manner brisk but not harsh, simply ensuring everyone was conscious and prepared for morning formation. The routine felt military rather than punitive, maintaining discipline without cruelty. Outside, the November air carried a crispness that István would have found painful days earlier, but the combination of proper sleep and adequate clothing made it merely uncomfortable. The prisoners formed ragged lines, their military training reasserting itself despite months of deterioration. American personnel conducted a head count with the same bureaucratic efficiency that characterized all their operations. Then came the order that would begin transforming István's understanding of everything: prisoners will proceed to the mess facility for morning rations. The interpreter's translation was straightforward, but something in his tone suggested suppressed amusement, as if he knew what was coming and anticipated the prisoners' reactions. The mess hall was a large temporary structure, essentially a tent reinforced with wooden framing and equipped with industrial cooking facilities. The smell that hit István as he entered was so overwhelming that he stopped walking, causing a momentary backup in the line. It wasn't just food cooking, but good food, the kind of rich aromas he associated with peacetime celebrations and family gatherings. American personnel directed the prisoners through a serving line where uniformed cooks stood ready with large serving implements. This was the first indication that something unexpected was happening. In German facilities, prisoners received pre-portioned rations distributed in a manner that minimized interaction and emphasized scarcity. Here, the Americans were apparently going to serve food directly, in real time, from cooking facilities. István picked up a metal tray, noting its substantial weight and durability. This wasn't a disposable container or repurposed tin, but a proper mess tray designed for repeated use. The first station offered scrambled eggs, rail eggs prepared with what appeared to be butter and cream. The cook scooped a portion onto Istvan's tray that exceeded what he would have considered reasonable for a full meal, let alone a component of breakfast. The next station provided bacon, actual pork bacon, crispy strips that glistened with fat. Again, the portion was generous beyond sense, multiple strips that represented more meat than Istvan had consumed in the previous month. His hands began shaking as the implications of what he was witnessing started penetrating his understanding. Fried potatoes came next, seasoned and cooked to golden perfection. Then toast, multiple slices of real wheat bread that could be spread with butter or jam from containers placed at each table. Fresh oranges, whole fruit that Istvan hadn't seen since before the war, were stacked in baskets for prisoners to take freely. Coffee, real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute that Germans called coffee, was available in large urns with fresh cream and sugar. The smell alone was intoxicating, carrying associations of normalcy and abundance that seemed impossible in a military context. Istvan carried his overloaded tray to a table, moving mechanically as his mind struggled to process what was happening. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions, their faces showing confusion, suspicion, and growing realization. Zoltan sat down beside him, staring at his own tray with an expression somewhere between laughter and tears. "This is more food than I served customers in my butcher shop during rationing," Zoltan said quietly. "And we're prisoners. Enemy combatants. They're feeding us better than we fed civilians at home." His voice carried a tremor that suggested the psychological foundations of his worldview were beginning to crack. The first bite of eggs nearly overwhelmed Istvan. The richness, the actual flavor of properly cooked food with adequate fat and seasoning, triggered responses he had forgotten his body could produce. He had to stop eating briefly, his eyes watering from something that wasn't quite emotion but wasn't entirely physical either. Mihai, sitting across the table, had been watching the newcomers with knowing sympathy. "I told you words weren't adequate. This is what I meant. This is what American soldiers eat. Not special rations, not officers' privileges, but standard military food for ordinary troops." The implications were staggering. If this was standard American military ration, what did that suggest about American productive capacity? About resource allocation? About the economic foundation supporting their war effort? Istvan had been taught that America was stretched thin, barely managing to supply forces on multiple fronts. This breakfast suggested otherwise. A Hungarian officer, Captain Laszlo Horváth, who had been captured with a different unit, stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is psychological warfare," he announced to the assembled prisoners. "They're trying to demoralize us by demonstrating abundance. Don't let it affect you. This is wasteful, decadent, proof of democratic excess that will ultimately ensure their defeat." But his words rang hollow, sounding like desperate recitation of propaganda rather than genuine conviction. Around the mess hall, prisoners continued eating with focused intensity, their bodies overriding whatever ideological resistance their minds attempted to maintain. An American sergeant, noticing the disturbance, approached Captain Horváth with the interpreter. "Is there a problem with the food, sir?" he asked through translation, his tone suggesting genuine concern rather than mockery. "If you have dietary restrictions or preferences, we can accommodate them." The offer to accommodate preferences, to treat enemy prisoners as individuals with legitimate needs rather than generic mouths to feed, represented a conceptual framework that Captain Horváth clearly had no idea how to process. He sat down without responding, returning to his meal with mechanical movements. Istvan forced himself to eat slowly, knowing that his shrunken stomach couldn't handle the volume of food on his tray despite what his hunger demanded. He had seen other prisoners making themselves sick by overeating after the first meal, their bodies rebelling against sudden plenty. The graduated feeding program the doctor mentioned made more sense now. This quantity of rich food could actually be dangerous for men in their condition. As breakfast concluded, American personnel began clearing tables and directing prisoners to deposit their trays at washing stations. the efficiency of this operation revealed another layer of American organizational capacity. Everything had a system, a process, a standard procedure that minimized waste and maximized efficiency. Walking back to the barracks, István found himself beside Zoltán, both men moving slowly as their bodies struggled to process unaccustomed nutrition. "I need to understand this," István said quietly. "We need to understand what this means. Because if this is standard military ration, if American soldiers eat like this routinely, then everything we've been told about this war is wrong." Zoltán nodded slowly. "My uncle immigrated to America in 1920. He wrote letters about abundance, about waste, about food being so cheap that restaurants threw away more than families ate. We thought he was exaggerating, telling stories to make his immigration seem successful. Maybe he wasn't exaggerating at all. The morning brought work assignments, routine maintenance tasks that kept prisoners occupied while serving genuine camp needs. István was assigned to a group repairing roads damaged by recent rains. The work was physical but not excessive, and American guards maintained supervision that seemed designed to prevent escape attempts rather than extract maximum labor. During a mid-morning break, guards distributed additional rations. Sandwiches, thick constructions of bread, meat, cheese, and vegetables that constituted full meals in themselves, were handed out casually as snacks to sustain workers until lunch. István accepted his sandwich with growing numbness, the continuing demonstration of abundance becoming almost routine in its shock value. Lunch arrived at 1200, served in the same mess facility with similar plenty. Beef stew, thick with actual chunks of meat and vegetables and rich gravy. Fresh bread, multiple slices. Salad, real vegetables dressed with oil and vinegar. Milk, whole milk in quantities István associated with childhood on his grandfather's farm. And dessert, actual cake with frosting, served as if sugar wasn't being rationed across the entire European continent. Mihai sat beside István again, having been assigned to a different work detail. "You're starting to understand now," he said, not quite a question. "You're beginning to see what we're up against. Not just better weapons or more soldiers, but a society that can afford to feed enemy prisoners better than our own governments fed us while we were fighting for them." The afternoon work session passed in a kind of fugue state, István's body performing tasks while his mind grappled with implications that seemed to expand with each observation. The American guards carried equipment that showed no signs of shortage or improvisation. Their uniforms were new, their boots unrepaired, their weapons maintained to standards that suggested unlimited access to parts and materials. One guard, a young private from somewhere called Ohio, shared cigarettes during a break, offering them freely to prisoners without apparent concern for cost or supply. The cigarettes were fresh, high quality, and he had enough to give away freely while keeping plenty for himself. This casual generosity with luxury items reinforced the message implicit in every interaction: America had so much that even guards could afford to be wasteful. Dinner that evening brought another elaborate meal. Roasted chicken, actual poultry that had been expensive luxury even before the war. Mashed potatoes swimming in butter and gravy. Green beans cooked with bacon. More bread, more butter, more dessert. The continuing abundance was becoming psychologically oppressive, each meal hammering home the same devastating message about relative national capacity. That night, unable to sleep despite physical exhaustion, István joined a group of prisoners gathered in the barracks' common area. The conversation had turned serious, men trying to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had believed about the war. Captain Horvath attempted to maintain ideological discipline. "This is temporary," he insisted. "They're treating us well now, but when their supply lines collapse, when their economy fails under wartime pressure, they'll revert to brutality. This abundance is unsustainable." But a young private, barely 19, challenged him with a question that silenced the room. "Sir, what if it's not unsustainable? What if this is normal for them? My brother was captured by the Russians. I received a Red Cross letter saying he's in Siberia, working in mines, starving. The Americans captured me, and I'm eating better than I ever did at home. What does that tell us about which side can actually afford to wage this war?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable because answering it required abandoning assumptions that had sustained them through years of hardship. If America could treat prisoners this well while fighting globally, what did that suggest about their capacity to sustain the war effort? About the ultimate outcome? Zoltán, who had remained quiet during the debate, finally spoke with the kind of simple observation that cut through ideological complexity. I've been in food service my entire adult life. I understand supply chains, rationing, resource allocation. What we're seeing here isn't possible unless their baseline production exceeds our maximum output by factors I can't calculate. They're not straining to feed us. What did that reveal about American society, about individual economic capacity, about the gap between their world and the one these soldiers came from? Another medic joined the first, carrying a similar personal meal. This one had what appeared to be leftovers from a home-cooked meal, reheated in some facility István couldn't see. Roasted meat, seasoned vegetables, bread that looked artisanal rather than mass-produced. The two men ate while chatting casually, their body language suggesting this was unremarkable routine rather than special occasion. Zoltán's hands had begun shaking, his professional background making him more sensitive to the implications than István could fully grasp. Do you understand what this means? Zoltán asked, his voice barely above a whisper. These men, ordinary enlisted soldiers, can afford to purchase or prepare personal meals that exceed what officers ate in our army. The gap isn't just between military rations. It's between entire economic systems. Captain Horvath, who had been supervising another part of the work detail, approached after noticing the prisoners' distraction. He followed their gaze to the medics, observed for several moments, then turned away without comment. His face had gone pale, and István saw his hands clench into fists before deliberately relaxing. The American corporal supervising their work noticed the disturbance and walked over, concerned about the pause in activity. Through the interpreter who accompanied work details, he asked if there was a problem. István, still processing what he was witnessing, couldn't formulate a response that made sense. It was Mihai who finally spoke, his words coming slowly as if he was testing their validity even as he uttered them. Those medics, they're eating personal food they brought themselves. That food looks better than what officers received in our army. How can ordinary soldiers afford such things? The American corporal looked confused by the question, as if unable to understand why this required explanation. Through the interpreter, he responded with casual matter-of-factness that was more devastating than any propaganda could have been. Sure, that's their personal food. Most guys bring lunch from home or buy from local shops during leave. Military rations are fine, but everyone likes variety. Those medics probably make $15, $20 extra each month beyond room and board. That's enough for personal items, entertainment, saving for after the war. The concept of soldiers having discretionary income, of being able to purchase luxury items beyond basic necessities, of saving money while actively serving in a war zone, contradicted everything István understood about military economics. In Hungarian and German forces, soldiers were paid nominal amounts that barely covered basic needs. The idea of entertainment budgets and savings programs seemed fantastical. But the evidence sat 20 meters away, eating lunch that represented economic capacity István couldn't reconcile with his understanding of wartime resource allocation. These weren't officers or specialists receiving premium compensation. These were ordinary enlisted medics, probably conscripts like himself, yet they lived with economic freedom that exceeded Hungarian middle-class standards before the war. Zoltán had started laughing, a sound edged with something close to hysteria. We ridiculed their army portions, he said between gasps. We made jokes about American excess and waste. We thought the generous rations proved their weakness, their inability to function without luxury. But those rations are baseline necessity. This, he gestured toward the medics, this is what they consider normal personal consumption beyond military provisions. The work detail resumed, but the psychological impact of what they had witnessed continued expanding through István's consciousness. Every assumption about American capacity, about democratic weakness, about the inevitable triumph of disciplined scarcity over wasteful abundance, all of it crumbled under the weight of this simple observation. That evening, as prisoners gathered for another abundant dinner, István found himself unable to eat with his previous intensity. The food that had shocked him days earlier now seemed less impressive, merely adequate baseline provision for an economy that operated on scales he couldn't comprehend. The real revelation was in what existed beyond these provisions, in the personal economic capacity that allowed ordinary soldiers to supplement already generous rations with luxury items purchased from discretionary income. Mihai sat beside him, pushing food around his plate with distracted movements. "I keep thinking about my family," Mihai said quietly. "This is easy for them." The gathering dispersed slowly, men returning to bunks to wrestle privately with implications that challenged their entire understanding of the conflict. István lay in darkness, his full stomach a constant reminder of everything he was learning, everything he had been wrong about. But what István didn't yet know was that the most devastating revelation was still to come. The breakfast, the lunch, the dinner, all the abundance he had witnessed, was merely standard military ration. Tomorrow, he would discover what American medics ate. And that discovery would shatter whatever remained of his assumptions about American society, military logistics, and the true nature of the war he had been fighting. The real shock wasn't in what America gave to prisoners, but in what it provided for the soldiers who cared for them. The answer would come in a way István never expected, through an encounter that would reveal the deepest truth about American abundance, that even their humanitarian personnel ate better than enemy generals. The third morning at Camp Norton began like the previous two, with the same routine that was rapidly becoming familiar yet remained psychologically disorienting. István woke to the sound of American guards moving through the barracks, their voices carrying the casual tone of men performing routine duties rather than guarding dangerous enemies. The heating system hummed steadily, maintaining a temperature that would have seemed luxurious in any German facility he had experienced. Breakfast proceeded with the same overwhelming abundance. Pancakes this morning, stacked high and served with butter and syrup that István had learned was made from actual maple trees rather than chemical substitutes. Sausages, eggs, fruit, coffee with real cream. The continuing plenty had begun dulling his shock response, replacing initial amazement with a creeping sense of normalization that felt like betrayal of his former beliefs. The work assignment that morning placed István on a detail repairing a storage building near the camp medical facility. The task was straightforward, replacing damaged roofing materials under the supervision of an American corporal who seemed more interested in ensuring safety than extracting maximum labor. The other prisoners on the detail included Zoltán and Mihai, creating a small group that had begun forming bonds through shared experience. Around mid-morning, as István was carrying supplies from a truck to the worksite, he noticed activity at the medical facility. American medics were taking their break, gathering in a small outdoor area adjacent to their building. What happened next would fundamentally alter his understanding of American military culture in ways that standard prisoner rations never could. One of the medics, a tall man with corporal stripes, emerged from the building carrying what appeared to be his lunch. He sat on a bench visible from István's position, perhaps 20 meters away. The medic opened a container and began eating with the casual manner of someone performing a routine task without particular thought or attention. István continued working, but his attention kept returning to the medic. Something about the man's meal nagged at his consciousness, though he couldn't immediately identify what had caught his attention. It was Zoltán who first articulated the observation that István had been processing subconsciously. "Look at what that medic is eating," Zoltán whispered, his voice carrying an edge of disbelief. "That's not from the mess hall. That's personal food. He brought that from somewhere else." István stopped working entirely, focusing on the medic's meal with sudden intensity. Zoltán was right. The container wasn't standard military issue but appeared to be a personal item. And the food inside looked different from mess hall offerings, more varied, more elaborate, suggesting preparation with access to ingredients beyond institutional cooking. The medic ate a sandwich that appeared to contain multiple types of meat, cheese, lettuce, tomatoes, and other vegetables István couldn't identify from this distance. Beside the sandwich sat fresh fruit, not the standard orange or apple from mess hall baskets, but something exotic that István didn't recognize. A thermos provided what was presumably coffee or another beverage. And there were baked goods, cookies or small cakes that looked homemade rather than mass-produced. Mihai had joined them in watching, his expression showing the same confusion István felt. "That's his personal lunch," Mihai said slowly, working through implications as he spoke. "He brought that from home or purchased it himself. Which means that's what ordinary American soldiers can afford for themselves beyond their military rations." The observation hit István with physical force. The breakfast they had mocked as wasteful excess, the lunches and dinners that had seemed impossibly abundant, those were baseline military provisions. This medic, on his own resources, could afford food that exceeded even those generous standards. "My father worked his entire life and never had economic security. He died worried about whether my mother would have enough to survive. These American soldiers, boys younger than me, have savings accounts and entertainment budgets while fighting a war on another continent. What does that say about the societies we were defending?" The question required no answer because the answer was obvious and devastating. They had been fighting for nations that couldn't afford to feed their soldiers adequately, couldn't provide basic economic security, couldn't offer hope beyond survival. America was fighting with soldiers who had personal savings, who could afford luxury items, who expected to return home to economic opportunity rather than merely continued existence. Captain Horvath stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor with harsh sound that drew attention throughout the mess hall. He walked out without finishing his meal, his posture radiating something between rage and despair. The other officers watched him go, their faces showing recognition of whatever internal crisis he was experiencing. That night, lying in his heated bunk with a full stomach, István tried to calculate the implications of what he had learned. The American military could afford to feed prisoners lavishly, equip soldiers with quality gear, maintain medical facilities that treated enemies as well as allies, and still provide individual soldiers with discretionary income for personal purchases. The resource base required for such operations exceeded anything European nations could match, even in peacetime. The propaganda about American weakness had been backwards. American abundance wasn't a vulnerability but the foundation of unstoppable strength. A nation that could afford such apparent waste was a nation with productive capacity that rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. Victory wouldn't come from superior discipline or ideological commitment, but from the simple mathematics of overwhelming material advantage. Zoltan's voice came from the darkness of the nearby bunk. "Tomorrow they're starting a canteen where prisoners can purchase personal items using script earned through work. Cigarettes, toiletries, candy, magazines. They're creating a prisoner economy that mirrors civilian life. Even in captivity, they're demonstrating abundance." István acknowledged the comment but couldn't formulate a meaningful response. What could he say that would encompass the totality of his transformed understanding? The war was lost, not through battlefield defeats but through economic impossibility. They had been fighting a nation that operated on different rules, with resources that made victory mathematically impossible regardless of courage, skill, or determination. Sleep came eventually, though István's dreams were troubled by images of endless plenty, of soldiers eating personal lunches that exceeded officer rations, of an economy so vast that it could afford waste on scales that rendered traditional concepts of military logistics obsolete. He had entered American captivity expecting privation and found abundance. He had witnessed standard military rations and been shocked. But seeing what ordinary soldiers could afford beyond those rations had revealed a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat. The next morning would bring new revelations, new demonstrations of American capacity, new evidence that the world István had known was fundamentally different from the reality these soldiers inhabited. But nothing would match the psychological impact of those medics eating lunch, casually consuming personal food that represented economic freedom István had never imagined possible for ordinary people. The fireworks of understanding that exploded in his mind that day would continue illuminating harsh truths about the war, about his nation's choices, about the price of ideological commitment to systems that couldn't compete with democratic abundance. The transformation that began with ridicule of army portions had culminated in the devastating realization that those portions represented merely baseline provision in an economy that operated beyond Hungarian comprehension. The echoes of that lunch break would reverberate through István's remaining captivity and into the decades that followed. He would return to Hungary carrying memories that contradicted every propaganda message, every ideological assumption, every comfortable belief about the war's necessity or winnable nature. His testimony, shared quietly with family and friends, would plant seeds of doubt about the systems that had led them into unwinnable conflict. Years later, when historians would examine prisoner testimonies from American camps, István's account would stand out for its focus on that single moment, on medics eating lunch. Not the elaborate meals or generous rations, but the casual personal consumption that revealed economic capacity rendering traditional warfare obsolete. That image, more than any battle or strategic defeat, captured the truth about why the war was lost before it ever truly began. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.